read it because he's lying.
Well, there's a lot to that too. But I'm going to be speaking today on the subject of flags, true and false. It's an honor for me to be here in Western Massachusetts. We're in the shadow of the Springfield Armory. We're on ground that the men of the Shays Rebellion walked. And we're here on the anniversary of Flag Day. You know, we're here today in the Northeast at the ground zero of the greatest, grimmest battle for Second Amendment rights in this country's history since 1775. Here, New York, Connecticut, coming up Rhode Island, this is ground zero. And it is appropriate that this is taking place on the same ground that the founders struggled and fought and bled and died on. This is, to the rest of us in the rest of the country, wholly unexpected. We in the South and the West long ago wrote you all off. You know, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, we wrote you off as hopelessly overrun with collectivist nanny-staters. And yet, since Sandy Hook, you've shown the rest of us how to fight, how to face the enemy, how to resist. You are, in a very real sense, now behind enemy lines. And yet, with your own futures on the line, you have refused to knuckle under to the people who have made you criminals and hostage to their own tyrannical appetites for your liberty, your property, and your lives. In the face of becoming felons, the firearms owners of Connecticut have achieved an 85% non-compliance rate. 85%. In New York, it is estimated that the non-compliance rate may be as much as 95%. 95%. And the politicians don't know whether to defecate or go blind. They are not enforcing their law that they passed with such fanfare because they're afraid of what will happen if they do. As Ben Franklin once said, I think he was paraphrasing Ben Jonson, he said, "Nothing concentrates the mind so wonderfully as the prospect of being hung in the morning." And the minds of these tyrant wannabes are being concentrated by your actions.
Yeah.
Give yourself a hand.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Now, I admit I did try to do my part by publicizing the home addresses and phone numbers and email addresses on my blog of every politician in Connecticut that voted for this intolerable act.
Thank you.
Woo! And I discovered something odd. These people like to put you on lists, but they don't like people to put them on a list. Go figure. All right? But I'm here to thank you all for their caution, for their fear. They're not scared of me. They're scared of you. They are scared of you and what you will do if they enforce their intolerable act. So give yourself a hand. You deserve it. And I'm here to thank you on behalf of the rest of the country for what you are doing now, for what you are risking, and for what you will do and risk in the future. Now, this June 14th also marks the 29th birthday of the United States Army. When the Continental Congress assumed authority for the militia that was then surrounding the British in Boston in 1775 after Lexington and Concord, they nominated George Washington to be commander the next day. And he came here and assumed command of the first truly American army. But you know, there are other countries that also mark the 14th of June with solemnity, but more in sorrow than in celebration, as we do. For the people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the 14th of June is known as a day of commemoration and mourning, because it was on this day in 1940 that the Soviet Russians arrested and deported hundreds of thousands of their citizens at gunpoint. Hundreds of thousands. And shipped them to Siberia in cattle cars in a brutal internal exile in which tens of thousands of them died, never coming home. These deportees included almost the entire political and military leaderships of their respective countries and their families, along with many ordinary people, including Jews, that were viewed by Stalin's secret police as politically unreliable. Politically unreliable, that's a pretty great term, isn't it, if you think about it? The last of these surviving deportees did not return home until 1963, long after Stalin was dead. So it is proper today, on the 14th of June, and pertinent for us as Americans to remember these atrocities as well, for they remind us of what always happens when governments rule over disarmed people and possess a monopoly of violence. So as we stand here today in celebration of our own Flag Day, let us remember these victims of government tyranny. Let us remember not only for their now extinguished souls, but let us pray that we have the wisdom to never follow in their footsteps. Now, our own Flag Day marks the date in 1777 when our first national colors, the Betsy Ross flag, was adopted by the Continental Congress. This was not the first flag carried into battle by the revolutionaries in their battles with the king. Throughout our colonial history, militia units sported their own unit colors, the oldest of which still surviving was the flag of the Bedford Minutemen, carried at Concord, which showed a mailed arm emerging from the clouds, grasping a sword with the Latin motto, which meant conquer or die. The Boston Liberty flag, which flew over the Liberty Elm in Hanover Square in Boston, or as you say, Boston. I talk funny, so. It was made up of 9 horizontal alternating white and red stripes, which is where, in the end, we got our 13 stripes for the Stars and Stripes. Other flags with other images were flown, from beavers to pine trees to rattlesnakes, bearing mottos such as hope, liberty, and appeal to heaven. And most recognizable today, don't tread on me. The rattlesnake of the Gadsden flag was considered by many colonists to be particularly appropriate. Wrote one in 1775, I recollected that her eye excelled in brightness that of any other animal, and that she has no eyelids. She may, therefore, be esteemed an emblem of vigilance. She never begins an attack, nor once engaged ever surrenders. She is therefore an emblem of magnanimity, and true courage. But it was the Stars and Stripes and not the rattlesnake flag that the Continental Congress adopted that day so long ago, and that we recognize as our national colors today, albeit with a field of 50 stars rather than a circle of 13. It is the banner of the Stars and Stripes that has flown over battlefields as far flung as Fort McHenry, Germany, the Aushau Valley, the Chosin Reservoir, Bataan, Corregidor, and Iwo Jima. In our hearts and around the world, it is the Stars and Stripes, whether worn on a uniform, displayed from the radio antenna of a fighting vehicle, painted on the side of an aircraft, or printed on a pallet of relief supplies, that proclaims to all, here is America. It is the Stars and Stripes that have been carried by all sides in every protest movement throughout our history. For every point of view wants to proclaim that it, and not the other side, is the American point of view, no matter how true or false that proposition may be. It is the Stars and Stripes with which we bury our war dead and our veterans. It is the Stars and Stripes that our courts permit to be burned in protest, because we recognize the reality of free speech that such an act represents is more important than the piece of cloth that represents it, that symbolizes it. And think about that. Think about how powerful a country that you live in, that will allow its own symbol to be burned to prove our liberty. And that's a good thing. Yet throughout our history, we have died defending that symbol, rescuing it sometimes with acts of unbelievable bravery, tearing it into pieces when it looked like the enemy threatened to capture it. Men and women have died and will continue to die for that symbol because it represents something much larger than ourselves, our liberty, our unity, our history. And we all believe it represents our future and that of our children's children's children. But as I've said before in other places and other times, we are today, in fact, two nations, as they were in 1775, divided by the answer to this fundamental question: does the government serve the people, or do the people serve the government? Whatever the individual issue that we fight over these days, the answer always boils down to that. Who serves whom? Do we serve the government, or does the government serve us as the founders intended?
They serve us!
And yet, however we answer that question, it is certainly true that both sides embrace the same flag. Yet how can that be when we try to fold it around such mutually contradictory beliefs? If one side or the other is right about who serves whom, then one side represents the true nature, the true philosophy behind that flag, and the other does not. Throughout our history, all sides have claimed her, have wrapped their causes in her. The same flag carried by civil rights marchers in the 60s was brandished by the Klan at rallies and even in lynchings, in both South and North. Did the flag truly represent both? Did it represent either? Scoundrels and would-be tyrants throughout our history have wrapped themselves in her, disguising their evil intent in affected patriotism, in quote-unquote Americanism, however they wanted to define that term. and regardless of whether the founders would recognize it or not. Indeed, by claiming as it does to represent all of us, regardless of our mutually exclusive beliefs, in times like these, it comes close to representing none of us. In the end, the Stars and Stripes will represent whichever side wins the argument of the answer to that question. Does the government serve the people, or do the people serve the government? The flag, in the end, will continue to represent liberty and the founders' republic, or it will represent a masked tyranny hateful to the founders' intent. These are sobering thoughts on this Flag Day, but they are true nonetheless. We must answer that question at the end of history. Which country does the Stars and Stripes represent? For in the end, it certainly cannot be both. The Gadsden flag, with its threatening rattlesnake and bold warning, "Don't tread on me," is perhaps more plainly honest, more unambiguous than the Stars and Stripes. Freed of the burden of being the national colors, which seem to be saddled with the necessity of being all things to all people, the Gadsden flag is plain in its declaration of free men and the rights to our own liberty and property and lives. Don't tread on me, it warns. Or in the words of some of this generation, don't start nothing, won't be nothing. It is not as blunt as the Gonzales flag of Texas history, with its image of a cannon and the challenge, "Come and take it." But it is close enough, as they say, for government work. This is why the Gadsden flag is so popular at rallies of today's liberty movements, from the Tea Party to the protesters of the federal land grab at the Bundy Ranch in the West to Second Amendment activists of today. The message is clear. There is a line, Mr. Government Bureaucrat, that you cross at your own deadly peril. Don't tread on me. Don't tread on us. It is for this reason that the collectivists, the domestic enemies of the founders' republic, are made somewhat deranged, if not enraged, by the Gadsden flag. Its sentiment is plain. It cannot be polluted or corrupted or co-opted. They must therefore do their best to demonize it, to discredit it, to profane it, and to lie about those who fly it. We have seen that very clearly in their reaction to the Miller meth head murderers out in Nevada, in their use of the Gadsden flag in their rampage, placing it on the body of a dead police officer. Our enemies proclaim that this flag is itself anti-government, and proof that the Millers represent the rest of us, quote, anti-government types. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not anti-government, although the Southern Poverty Law Center has been calling me that for about 2 decades.
Good. Badge of honor.
I am, in fact, pro-government, of the kind of government that the founders would recognize. I am pro-small government, pro-safe government, a government of limited powers, a government that supports the rule of law and operates within it. When our enemies, these domestic enemies of the Constitution that the founders warned us about, call us anti-government, what they mean is that we are anti-do it our way or we'll kill you government.
That's me.
Now, of course, they're right about that, but they cannot honestly admit that to other people. So they are trying to convince everyone by calling us anti-government and hope the lie sticks. But flags are symbols. They are shorthand for who you are and what you represent and what you love. I told you I need a teleprompter. And it's a great podium, too. So if they can discredit our symbol and co-opt another to their purposes, they are more than halfway there on the road to the victory of the collective over the individual. For there is nothing more effective, more dangerous than a lie accepted as fact. Now, I hold in my hand proof of that statement. You know, I met the Millers briefly at the Bundy standoff when they came to volunteer. They struck me as a danger to the mission of protecting the Bundys at first glance. Jared projected the undeniable ambiance of a methamphetamine addict that his neighbors later said that he was. He was heavily tattooed. He admitted under questioning he was a convicted felon, despite the fact that he was packing a semi-automatic pistol on his hip. Now, I counseled Stuart Rhodes of Oath Keepers and Jared DeLemus, who ran the security operation, that these people better be sent packing and quickly. And they were. And they went home, we thought. Turns out they went to Las Vegas and resettled there with deadly consequences. The Millers later complained on their Facebook page that they had been turned away. Of course, we had no inkling that the Millers would later turn violent, nor could we have. These facts have not prevented the collectivist media from tying the Millers to the Bundys or to us, or, according to this official document of the New York State Police, to me. Now, this document is entitled New York State Counterterrorism Bulletin CTB 14-07, Recent Spike in Violence Targeting Law Enforcement, dated 2 days ago. Now, it's been issued by something called the New York State Intelligence Center, but we're going to deconstruct it here, and I'll leave it to your own estimation of exactly how much intelligence it does represent. Its use of loaded language, of conflation, and what I call guilt by disassociation makes it a minor classic of the breed. It mentions, among others, that the Millers, and it claims, quote, evidence at the scene and further investigation revealed the Millers embraced a far-right militia ideology, close quote. Now, I've been in and around the constitutional militia movement for 20 years. I'm the founder of the National 3% movement, and while 3%ers pledged to resist and further efforts at firearms confiscation, we are also based on some bedrock principles. Among these are no first use of force. We call this no Fort Sumters. And an absolute prohibition on the targeting of innocents or the acceptance of what is called collateral damage. We call this no Oklahoma City bombings. In this, of course, we are more fussy than past and present federal administrations. But we believe that it is vital not to become the monster you claim to fight.
No more Wacos.
And it also includes no more Wacos and no more Katrinas. You're quite right. Given that, it is impossible for the Millers to have, quote, embraced a far-right militia ideology. They were not members of any militia. Their actions were contrary to every understanding I have and that the founders had of what militia actually is. But this doesn't keep an official state police agency from claiming it to be so. The report mentions that the Millers draped one of the slain officers with the Gadsden flag, yet admits that, quote, Jared Miller had a over decades long criminal history, sorry, I slipped into the accent there, criminal history in multiple states, including misdemeanor battery and drug trafficking, close quote. And further admits that they were turned away from the Bundy Ranch. But this, quote, intelligence report saves the worst for last. And it refers here to the Canadian case. But says, in the Miller case, the perpetrators were concerned with common far-right conspiracies involving government seizure of private firearms with the passage of the New York SAFE Act in January 2013. A growing number of far-right extremists, particularly militia and sovereign citizens, may view New York State as a more attractive target to further their agenda, close quote. Now, know what's happening with this extraordinary statement. First, these official representatives of the state of New York conflate militia folks and the evil boogeyman of sovereign citizens. Second, they're saying, and if I've got this right, because we're trying to confiscate their firearms with the SAFE Act, these dangerous people have concluded that we're trying to confiscate their firearms. Okay. So now the New York State Police have determined that you're paranoid even if someone is trying to kill you. Well, of course. Didn't we all know that? You paranoids, you. And the number one paranoid in the eyes of the New York State Police, well, that would be me. I'm not done yet. Let me give you the next paragraph in the official voice. Michael Brian Vanderboegh, a longtime militia member and founder of the 3% Patriot movement, which was supported by Jared and Amanda Miller, close quote. Now let's stop right there for a second. Right? First of all, I don't know where they get this 3% Patriot movement, because there is no patriot in anything I've ever written associated with the 3%, because the term was so abused and misused deliberately by the Southern Poverty Law Center in the 90s to tar, by association, different groups of people that were totally dissimilar. But they wanted to lump them all together for the purposes of scaring their donors into sending them more money. So I've never used the term 3% patriots. But they say I have. So anyway, now as far as the Millers being my supporters, close quote, David Codry of the War on Guns blog, who helped me break the Fast and Furious story back in 2010, has been all through the Millers' Facebook accounts, the various posts. And he tells me he can find no evidence of this alleged association. As I said, the only interaction I ever had with the Millers was to see that they were thrown out of the Bundy security operation. The report then notes that I, quote, traveled to New York State at least once in 2013 to speak to the Liberty Oath Keepers meeting in Monticello, New York, close quote. Now that's perfectly true. And what they fail to mention is the subject of that impromptu talk was how collectivists use the art of the lie to serve their purposes, which is kind of ironic if you think about it. But I can see why they wouldn't mention that. And if anybody doubts me, if you go to my website, Sipsey Street Irregulars, my various speeches, the Monticello talk is there. You can be certain and hear for yourself what I said about collectivists and their lies. Now the report continues. The 3% patriots, there's that patriot crap again, quote, are a militia group comprised primarily of gun rights extremists who believe in the need to use violence against the government to prevent what they believe to be an impending seizure of all private firearms, close quote. Now, the 3% movement is just that. It's a movement. It's an idea. It is not a militia. It is not an organization that can be infiltrated, provoked, or broken up. It is an idea, an ideal, really. And it cannot be killed. This is how I designed it. I deliberately did it this way for that reason. Insofar as the enforcers of the SAFE Act calling us, quote-unquote, extremists for fearing that someone might enforce the SAFE Act, well, the irony of that, which was pretty thick already, is approaching the thickness of the Earth's crust. The report continues, quote, the Oath Keepers is an organization composed of current and former military and law enforcement personnel who take a pledge that they will not obey any unconstitutional orders, such as orders to disarm the American people, to conduct warrantless searches, or to detain Americans as enemy combatants, close quote. Ooh. Now that sounds extreme. It's also all true, and it comes straight off of the Oath Keepers website. It's not like they're trying to hide it. Now then the report intones ominously, quote, there have been multiple observed instances of overlapping membership in the Oath Keepers and the 3%, and the Oath Keepers founder has spoken supportively of the 3% movement. Hey, I guess they're right. I see people out here that answer that description. Don't raise your hands and make these addled darn bureaucrats' jobs any easier, but you know who you are, and that's fine by me. But here's the thing. This is the last paragraph of this unclassified for official use only document that circulates to all federal, state, and local police organizations. And I quote, the recent attacks serve to highlight a trend of growing violence by far-right extremists that is likely to continue in the near term. Law enforcement should remain vigilant to any indicators or suspicious activity related to the persistent far-right extremist threat. As always, observance of suspicious individuals and activities should immediately be reported to the New York State Intelligence Center / Counterterrorism Center Terrorism Tips Line at 1-866-SAFE-NYS. That's 866-723-3697. Close quote. Now, if you want to report a suspicious person like me, or you want to self-report yourself, you can see me after the talk, and I'll be happy to give you the number. You didn't have to write it down. So, now let's recap here. The Millers are linked to the Bundys, except they're not. The Millers are supporters of Vanderbough, the guy that ejected them from the Bundy security operation, except they're not. The Millers are militia, except they weren't. They embrace militia values, except they didn't. The 3% movement is a militia, except it isn't. And the 3% are paranoids for believing that the New York State cops are going to seize semi-automatic weapons, except they are. Now, other than that, this report is totally accurate. I hope that clears things up for you. Now, that's funny, except it's not. You know that Governor Cuomo's finest were nice enough to footnote their various assertions. And you know the source of everything they wrote about me? the Anti-Defamation League, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. Although down in Alabama, we call them the Southern Preposterous Lie Center. You know, the FBI recently announced that they were no longer accepting SPLC intelligence reports because of political bias and factual errors. Unfortunately, the word doesn't seem to have penetrated to the New York State Political Police so-called intelligence unit. And like I said, whether that demonstrates true intelligence or not, I leave to you. It kind of reminds me of that old joke, you know, from Rocky and Bullwinkle. Moose and Squirrel are standing beside the garbage cans, you know. And all of a sudden, this guy in a trench coat and hat pops out, and he says, "I'm from military intelligence." And Rocky looks at him with this skewering glare and says, "Don't use contradictory terms." Well, like I said, it's funny, but it's not. You know, this report goes out to police everywhere, many of whom are going to accept it as gospel. And who do you think they're going to be reporting? You with the Oath Keepers t-shirt. You with the 3% patch. You with the Gadsden flag out in front of your house. Or the "Don't Tread on Me" sticker on your pickup truck. Because everyone now knows, because of sloppy propaganda like this piece of trash, that the Gadsden flag equals the 3%, equals Oath Keepers, equals right-wing extremists, equals terrorist, equals methamphetamine-fueled cop killer. And so on this Flag Day, remember that the real flag of liberty is the one that you wear in your heart.
That's right.
And in your head. Remember that symbols like the Stars and Stripes can be co-opted by evil men. And symbols like the Gadsden flag can be profaned by killers like the Millers, and distorted for political purpose by liars for money like the Southern Poverty Law Center, and uncritically reported by the tax-paid idiots that are the New York State Police. Wear your flag in your heart, but don't let the domestic enemies of the Constitution have the outward symbols of our ancestors' sacrifices in blood and tears. Do not let them wrap their lies in the Stars and Stripes without a fight. We say in the Pledge of Allegiance that it is to the flag and to the republic for which it stands that we pledge allegiance. We best honor the flag by preserving that republic and by fighting its enemies on whatever battlefield with determination and the truth. And I thank you very much for your time.